Look at your wrist, right now. Whether you're wearing a high-end mechanical piece, a rugged smartwatch, or just a simple band of leather, you are looking at a miracle of social engineering. You probably think that the act of straping a clock to your arm is a basic, utilitarian choice, a logical evolution of technology. You're wrong. For most of human history, if you were a man and you walked down the street with a watch on your wrist, you wouldn't have been seen as a tech-savvy early adopter. You would have been laughed at. You would have been mocked. To the Victorian or Edwardian man, a wristwatch was a piece of jewelry. It was a trinket. It was something a lady wore to a ball, alongside her silk gloves and pearl necklaces. It was, in every sense of the word, feminine. And yet today, the wristwatch is the ultimate symbol of masculinity. It's what we give to retirees, what soldiers use to time operations, and what billionaires use to signal their status. How did a girly bracelet become the world's most essential tool for men? The answer isn't found in a laboratory or a luxury boutique in Geneva. It's found in the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the Western Front. It is a story of how the brutal necessity of industrial slaughter forced humanity to redefine what it means to be a man. But to understand the revolution of the wrist, you first have to understand the tyranny of the pocket. Go back to the year 1890. Imagine you are a gentleman in London, Paris, or New York. You don't just check the time. Checking the time is a ritual. It is a three-stage performance. First, you reach into the small, dedicated pocket of your waistcoat, the fob. You grasp a heavy, gold-plated disc. You feel the weight of it in your palm, a solid, comforting piece of machinery. Then, you click open the hunter case cover with a satisfying snap. Finally, after consulting the Roman numerals, you close it and carefully slide it back into its velvet-lined dark. The pocket watch was not just a tool. It was an anchor. It anchored a man to his social class. It required a waistcoat, which required a suit, which required a certain type of life. It was a piece of architecture for the body. To take a watch out of your pocket was a sign that you were in control of your world. You had the leisure to stop, the luxury to use both hands, and the stability of a life lived indoors. In this world, the idea of a wristwatch, or a bracelet watch as they were called, was seen as a joke. They were called wristlets. They were delicate, flimsy things. They were prone to breaking, easy to steal, and worst of all, they were visible. A gentleman's time was private. A lady's time, according to the bizarre gender politics of the 19th century, was decorative. If you look at the archives of the great watchmakers like Patek Philippe, you'll see that the very first wristwatches ever made, dating back to 1868, were sold exclusively to countesses and socialites. They were encrusted with diamonds. They were fashion statements, not chronometers. They were designed to be looked at, not looked through. For a man to wear one was a social suicide. There are records from British newspapers in the late 1800s where journalists openly mocked the silly fad of men trying to attach watches to their arms. They called it more of a curiosity than a utility. They claimed that a man's arm was too active, too masculine, and violent for such a delicate instrument. The vibration of a man's movement would surely destroy the internal balance spring. Even the military, the very institution that would eventually save the wristwatch, initially hated it. In the late 19th century, the British War Office dismissed the idea of wristlets as unsoldierly. A soldier was supposed to be a pillar of iron. He didn't need a decorative bracelet. He had his pocket watch, tucked safely away, protected from the dust and the rain. But the world was changing. The Industrial Revolution was picking up speed, the sky was filling with coal smoke, and the rhythms of life were shifting from the rising of the sun to the ticking of the second hand. We were moving faster than our pockets could handle. The first cracks in the pocket watch's dominance didn't appear in the salons of the elite. They appeared in the heat of the British Empire's colonial wars. During the Third Anglo-Burmese War in 1885, and later the Boer War in South Africa, British officers began to realize a terrifying truth. When you are on a horse, holding a set of reins in one hand and a saber or a pistol in the other, you do not have three hands. You cannot perform the ritual of the pocket. If you need to know if your unit is supposed to charge at 0815 and you have to let go of your horse's reins to fingle in your waistcoat for a gold disc, you are probably going to die. Some officers, in a moment of desperate, ungentlemanly improvisation, began to take their pocket watches and strap them to their wrists using crude leather bands. They were called trench watches, though the name wouldn't stick for another few decades. At the time, they were seen as a necessary evil, a dirty, ugly compromise made by men in the heat of battle. But back in London, the elite still scoffed. The prestigious horological journal was still writing that the wristwatch was a passing craze that would never replace the dignified pocket watch. They couldn't imagine a world where a man would prioritize speed over dignity. They didn't realize that the 20th century wasn't going to be about dignity. It was going to be about synchronization. By 1904, a famous aviator named Alberto Santos Dumont approached his friend, a man named Louis Cartier. Santos Dumont complained that it was impossible to check his pocket watch while flying his experimental aircraft. He needed his hands on the controls. Cartier's solution was the Santos watch, the first purpose-built men's wristwatch. It was square, it was bold, and it was revolutionary. But even then, it remained a niche tool for adventurers and eccentrics. It was like the Google Glass of its era, technically impressive, but visually ridiculous to the average person. The average man still looked at his fob chain and felt secure. He felt like a man. He felt like the pocket watch was a shield against the chaos of the outside world. He was wrong. The pocket watch wasn't a shield. It was a relic. And the hammer that was about to shatter that relic was being forged in the factories of Krupp and Vickers. In June 1914, a teenager in Sarajevo fired a pistol. Within weeks, the rigid, polite, pocket watch-wearing world of the 19th century was dragged into the dirt. Millions of men were pulled out of their suits and waistcoats and shoved into wool tunics. They were sent into trenches where the air smelled like rotting meat and chlorine gas. And in that environment, the feminine wristwatch was about to become the most lethal weapon in the world. Think about the sheer physical reality of a trench in 1915. It is dark. It is wet. You are wearing 3 layers of wool, a heavy coat, and leather webbing. You are holding a rifle that weighs 9 pounds. If you need to coordinate a creeping barrage, a tactic where your artillery fires just a few yards ahead of your advancing infantry, timing is everything. If your watch is 5 seconds off, or if you take 5 seconds too long to pull it out of your pocket, your own cannons will tear you to pieces. The wristwatch wasn't about fashion anymore. It was about survival. It was about the terrifying, cold-blooded mathematics of modern war. The wristlet was about to lose its diamonds and its silk straps. It was about to gain luminous paint made of radioactive radium, so you could see it in the dark. It was about to gain shatterproof crystal covers, and as the war dragged on, the men back home, the ones who used to laugh at men in bracelets, stopped laughing. Because the men coming back from the front, the ones who had survived the hell of the Somme and Ypres, were all wearing them. And you didn't laugh at a man who had seen the end of the world. The transformation was starting. The feminine toy was being baptized in fire. But the struggle to make the world accept the wristwatch was only just beginning. Because as the soldiers learned to love the wrist, the people in power were realizing just how much they could control a human being once they had a clock permanently attached to his skin. To understand why the wristwatch became inevitable, you have to understand the terrifying evolution of murder. In 1914, the war started with the logic of the 19th century. Generals imagined grand cavalry charges, bright uniforms, and heroic maneuvers across open fields. They carried pocket watches because they imagined they would have the time to sit on a hill, pull out a gold disc, and calmly observe the battlefield through binoculars. But within months, the dream of the gentleman's war was buried under millions of tons of high explosives. The war didn't move, it dug in. It became a stalemate of trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. And in this new, static world of industrial slaughter, time was no longer a measurement of a day. Time was the difference between a successful advance and a massacre. This is where the most important tactical innovation of World War I comes in, the creeping barrage. Think about the sheer, cold-blooded mathematics of this tactic. Before the creeping barrage, artillery would shell the enemy trenches for hours or even days, then stop. The infantry would then climb over the top and charge. The problem? As soon as the shelling stopped, the enemy had 5 minutes to crawl out of their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and mow down the attackers. It was a recipe for suicide. The solution was the creeping barrage. The artillery wouldn't stop, it would move. The cannons would fire a wall of shrapnel and high explosives that would creep forward at a set pace, usually 100 yards every 2 or 3 minutes. The infantry was ordered to stay as close to that falling wall of fire as possible, sometimes within 50 yards. If you were too slow, the enemy would recover and kill you. If you were too fast, you would walk straight into your own exploding shells. Now imagine you are a platoon commander. You are standing in a hole in the ground. The noise is so loud it's literally vibrating your internal organs. The air is thick with the smell of cordite, wet wool, and human waste. You cannot hear your commanding officer. You cannot see more than 20 feet through the smoke. Your only connection to the plan, your only hope of not being vaporized by your own side, is a tiny device strapped to your wrist. You aren't looking at the sky. You aren't looking at the enemy. You are staring at the ticking second hand of a wristlet. When the second hand hits the mark, you blow your whistle. You move. Every man in your line moves. Thousands of men spread across miles of front, moving in perfect, terrifying synchronization, all governed by the tiny gears on their arms. This was the moment the wristwatch stopped being an accessory and became a component of a machine. The soldier was the motor, the watch was the regulator. If the watch failed, the machine broke. If the machine broke, thousands of men died in a single afternoon. This life or death pressure did something to watchmaking that 1,000 years of peace could never have achieved. It forced a brutal, rapid evolution. The first problem was shrapnel. The early wristwatches were essentially tiny pocket watches with wire lugs soldered onto them. They had thin, fragile glass covers. In a trench, glass breaks. A broken watch was a death sentence, so the shrapnel guard was born. If you look at photos of trench watches from 1915, you'll see these strange, aggressive-looking metal grills over the faces. They look like tiny cages. They were designed to let you see the time while protecting the glass from flying debris and the rough handling of a man crawling through the mud. But there was a second, even more difficult problem: the dark. The most dangerous operations happened at night. Patrolling no man's land, cutting barbed wire, or preparing for a dawn raid required absolute stealth. You couldn't strike a match to check your watch. A single spark would attract a sniper's bullet in seconds. The military needed a way to make time visible in total darkness. The solution was a substance that sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, and it would end up being one of the most tragic chapters in the history of industry: radium. In the early 1900s, radium was a miracle. Discovered by Marie Curie, it was a magical element that glowed with a faint, ghostly green light. It didn't need a battery. It didn't need to be charged by the sun. It just glowed, powered by its own slow radioactive decay. watch companies began mixing radium with zinc sulfide to create a luminous paint called undark. They painted the numbers, they painted the hands. For the first time in human history, a man could look at his arm in a pitch-black trench and see the time glowing back at him like the eye of a cat. It was a technological marvel. But behind that glow was a terrifying price. While the soldiers were using these glowing watches to survive the war, thousands of young women in factories in New Jersey, Connecticut, and Illinois, the Radium Girls, were painting those dials by hand. To get the fine point needed for the numbers, they were told to point the brushes with their lips. Every time they did, they swallowed a tiny amount of radium. The radium didn't just stay in their stomachs. It behaved like calcium. It went to their bones. It settled in their jaws, their hips, and their spines, slowly burning them from the inside out for years. Their skin began to glow in the dark. They would go home at night, and their hair would shimmer. They thought it was beautiful. They didn't know they were walking ghosts. This is the dark paradox of the wristwatch. The glow that allowed a soldier to time a gas attack in the middle of the night was the same glow that was dissolving the bones of the women who made the watches back home. The feminine jewelry of the 19th century was being replaced by a device that was literally radioactive. The wristwatch was no longer just a tool, it was an object of power, danger, and sacrifice. By 1916, the British War Office, the same institution that had called wristwatches unsoldierly 2 years earlier, issued a stunning directive. They began to officially purchase wristwatches in bulk. They weren't wristlets anymore, they were service watches. And then the great inversion began to happen. In the 19th century, if you wanted to look masculine, you carried a heavy gold pocket watch to show your wealth and your stability. But by the middle of the war, the pocket watch started to look like the mark of a coward. It was what the old men wore, the politicians and the generals who stayed behind in London and Paris while the young men died. The wristwatch, on the other hand, became the mark of the veteran. If you wore a watch on your wrist, it meant you had been over the top. It meant you had lived through the creeping barrage. It meant you were a man of action, a man of the 20th century. The leather strap wasn't a bracelet anymore. It was part of a uniform, like a bayonet or a gas mask. The manufacturers saw the shift. Companies like Rolex, Omega, and Zenith, which were still small players compared to the giants of American pocket watch manufacturing, began to pivot. They realized that the world after the war wasn't going to go back to the waistcoat. They started designing hermetic cases, early attempts at waterproofing. They knew that a watch that could survive the moisture of a trench could survive anything. Think about the engineering required here. A mechanical watch is a masterpiece of tiny, interlocking parts moving with incredible precision. Now, imagine putting that masterpiece in a box and subjecting it to the vibration of a 15-inch heavy howitzer firing a few feet away. Imagine it being submerged in liquid mud. Imagine it being exposed to the freezing cold of a high-altitude cockpit and the scorching heat of a desert patrol. The war was a 4-year-long, brutal stress test for every object in a man's life. The buttons on his coat became more durable. His boots became more ergonomic. His bags became more functional. But nothing transformed as radically as the watch. By the end of 1917, the wristwatch had achieved something that no marketing campaign could ever buy: universal trust. The 12 million men who served in the Allied and Central Powers were no longer the same people who had entered the war. They had been industrialized. They had learned that the only way to survive a world of machines was to become a machine themselves, to move on cue, to fire on cue, to live and die by the clock. And when they looked at their wrists, they didn't see a piece of feminine jewelry. They saw their own heartbeat reflected in the ticking of the balance wheel. But as the war began to wind down, a new question emerged. What happens when these millions of men go home? What happens when the soldier takes off his uniform and tries to put on his suit again? The pocket watch was waiting for them in their drawers. The gold chains, the velvet-lined boxes, the dignified Roman numerals. The old world was trying to reclaim them. The jewelry industry in New York and London was betting that the wristwatch was just a war curiosity, and that men would go back to their manly pockets as soon as the peace was signed. They were about to be hit by a wave of social change that would bankrupt half the companies in the world. Because the soldiers weren't coming home to the 19th century. They were bringing the 20th century back with them, strapped to their arms. And the transition from the trench watch to the modern watch was about to trigger a war of its own, a war over fashion, over status, and over what it actually meant to be a modern man in a world that had forgotten how to be quiet. The guns went silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. For the first time in 4 years, the world was quiet. But for the millions of men streaming back across the English Channel and the Atlantic, the world they were returning to was a ghost. They had left a world of horse-drawn carriages, rigid social codes, and gold pocket watches. They were coming back to a world that was faster, louder, and deeply traumatized. As these soldiers took off their mud-caked wool tunics and tried to squeeze back into their pre-war civilian suits, they encountered a strange physical conflict. The pocket watch, the heavy, dignified heart of the 19th century gentleman, was waiting for them in their dresser drawers. But something had changed. The ritual of the pocket now felt like a chore. It felt like a relic of a slower, more ignorant age. Think about the psychological shift here. A soldier who has spent 4 years timing a creeping barrage or a gas attack doesn't want to go back to fumbling for the time. He has spent 1,400 days with the time literally fused to his body. To him, the time isn't something you consult in private. It's something that lives with you. It's part of your pulse. But the watch industry back home, the massive, wealthy giants like Waltham and Elgin in the United States, and the traditional houses in London were in total denial. They looked at the trench watches on the veterans' wrists and saw battlefield scrap. They were convinced that as soon as a man put on a tuxedo or a business suit, he would realize how ugly and brutish a wristwatch looked. They expected the market to snap back to the pocket watch like a stretched rubber band. They were catastrophically wrong. The first sign of the collapse was the waistcoat. For centuries, the three-piece suit was the armor of the modern man. The waistcoat existed largely to provide a secure, central home for the pocket watch. But after the war, men were moving differently. They were driving cars. The Ford Model T was becoming a global phenomenon. They were riding motorcycles. They were working in offices that were more frantic and mechanized. If you are driving a car at 30 miles per hour on a bumpy dirt road, you cannot take your hand off the wheel, reach into your waistcoat, click open a gold case, and read the time. The car did to the civilian what the airplane had done to the pilot and the trench had done to the soldier. It made the pocket watch obsolete. Here is the part people always assume happened naturally. It didn't. The transition from feminine jewelry to masculine tool was a war of marketing. And the man who won that war was a visionary named Hans Wilsdorf. Wilsdorf was a German-born entrepreneur living in London who had founded a small watch assembly company called Rolex in 1905. Before the war, Wilsdorf was one of the few people who truly believed in the wristwatch. He spent a decade being mocked by the industry. But as the war ended, he realized he had the ultimate marketing asset, millions of heroic testimonials. Wilsdorf didn't just sell watches, he sold the veteran aesthetic. He realized that if he could associate the wristwatch with the hero of the psalm rather than the lady of the ballroom, the battle would be over. Watch advertisements in 1919 and 1920 underwent a radical transformation. Gone were the delicate floral borders and the soft cursive fonts. They were replaced by bold industrial imagery. They showed watches being submerged in water, watches being dropped, and watches being worn by men in flight gear. One famous ad from the era simply read, the watch that won the war. This was a stroke of genius. By branding the wristwatch as a military instrument, Wilsdorf and his competitors gave men permission to wear jewelry. It wasn't a bracelet anymore. It was equipment. It was a field instrument. It was a way to bring a piece of your bravery home with you. But there was a lingering technical problem that still made the wristwatch feel flimsy compared to the pocket watch: water and dust. A pocket watch lived in a dark, dry velvet pocket. A wristwatch lives in the impact zone. It's exposed to rain, sweat, and the constant dust of the street. The trench watches had been notorious for breathing in moisture, which would rust the delicate internal gears. If the wristwatch was going to survive in peace, it had to become a fortress. In 1926, Rolex released the Oyster case. It was the world's first truly waterproof and dustproof watch case. Wilsdorf, ever the showman, didn't just release a brochure. He waited for a moment of high drama. In 1927, a young typist named Mercedes Gleitz announced she was going to swim across the English Channel. Wilsdorf convinced her to wear a Rolex Oyster around her neck during the swim. After 10 hours in the freezing, salt-filled water of the channel, Gleitz emerged. The watch was in perfect working order. The story went viral. It was the final nail in the coffin of the pocket watch. If a watch could survive the English Channel, it could survive a rainy Tuesday in London. It could survive the shower. It could survive life. As the 1920s roared on, the wristwatch became the defining accessory of the new man. The Art Deco movement took the rugged, circular trench watch and began to flatten it, square it, and turn it into something elegant. The Cartier tank, designed in 1917 and inspired by the top-down view of a Renault tank on the Western Front, became the ultimate symbol of the sophisticated veteran. It was industrial, it was geometric, and it was undeniably modern. The social hierarchy was being completely rewritten. In 1890, the man with the gold pocket watch was the boss. But by 1925, the man with the gold pocket watch looked like a grandpa. He looked like someone who was stuck in the past. The rising executive, the pilot, the engineer, the man of the future, they all wore wristwatches. But as the wristwatch became a standard part of the male wardrobe, something deeper was happening to our relationship with time itself. In the era of the pocket watch, time was a secret. You owned your time. You decided when to look at it. There was a privacy to the act of pulling a watch from your pocket. But a wristwatch is public. The time is always there, exposed on your limb, visible to anyone standing near you. We moved from owning the time to being governed by it. The watch on the wrist was a permanent umbilical cord to the schedule of the factory, the office, and the city. It was the final victory of the Industrial Revolution over the human body. We didn't just carry a clock, we became part of the clock. Think about the sheer scale of the industry's collapse. Massive American companies that had dominated the world for 50 years with their pocket watches suddenly found themselves with warehouses full of inventory that nobody wanted. They tried to convert pocket watches into wristwatches by soldering on lugs, but they looked clunky and desperate. By the late 1920s, the big three of American watchmaking were in a tailspin. They had failed to see that the war hadn't just changed the gear of the soldier, it had changed the soul of the consumer. The wristwatch had successfully transitioned from feminine trinket to military necessity to civilian icon. It had survived the mud of Ypres and the salt of the English Channel. But just as the wristwatch reached its peak of social prestige, a new threat was emerging. A threat that didn't come from the past, but from the terrifying precision of the future. The mechanical watch, with its tiny hairsprings and hand-carved gears, was about to face a world that was becoming too precise for mechanical time. The service watch had won the war of fashion, but it was about to enter a war of physics. a war that would eventually lead us to a world where we no longer need to look at our wrists at all, but where the ghost of the trench watch still haunts every piece of technology we touch. Before we get to that, we have to look at the radium hangover, because as the world celebrated its new wristwatches in the late 1920s, the ghostly glow of the Radium Girls was finally starting to dim, and the scandal that followed would change the way we think about the cost of progress forever. People were starting to realize that the glowing hands of their watches weren't just a miracle, they were a warning. A warning that the modern world was built on a foundation of invisible poison. While the veterans of the 1920s were enjoying their new status as icons of modernity, and while brands like Rolex were proving their worth in the salt water of the English Channel, the wristwatch was hiding a dark, rotting secret. We have to talk about the part of the story that most luxury watch advertisements prefer to ignore. We have to talk about the Radium Girls. If you want to understand the sensory hardship of the early 20th century, you have to look past the muddy trenches and into the brightly lit factories of New Jersey and Illinois. Because the very feature that made the wristwatch a miracle of the war, the ability to see the time in total darkness, was built on a foundation of human sacrifice that is almost too gruesome to believe. In the 1920s, radium was seen as a gift from the gods. It was liquid sunshine. It was added to toothpaste, hair tonics, and even bottled water as a supposed health cure. But its most practical use was on the dials of the millions of wristwatches being pumped out for the civilian market. The glow was the ultimate selling point. And to get that glow onto the tiny numbers of a watch face, companies hired thousands of young women. Think about the physical reality of that job. You are 19 years old. You sit at a long table with hundreds of other girls. In front of you is a small pot of undark paint, a mixture of glue, zinc sulfide, and radium. Your task is to paint the numbers on a dial no larger than a coin. The brushes are made of fine camel hair, but after a few strokes, the bristles spread out. To make them sharp again, your supervisor teaches you a simple technique: lip, dip, paint. You put the brush in your mouth, use your tongue and lips to flatten the bristles into a point, dip it in the glowing paint, and apply it to the dial. You do this hundreds of times a day, 6 days a week. I want you to sit with that for a second. These women were literally eating the most radioactive substance known to man. They were told it was safe. They were told it would make their cheeks rosy. They were so covered in the dust that when they walked home at night, they glowed in the dark. They were called the Ghost Girls. They would paint their nails with the leftover radium. They would put it on their teeth so they could surprise their boyfriends with a glowing smile in the moonlight. But radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, and once it enters the human body, it doesn't leave. It masquerades as calcium. It travels to the bones. By the mid-1920s, the Ghost Girls started to break. It usually started in the jaw. Their teeth would loosen and fall out. When the dentist tried to remove a tooth, the entire jawbone would sometimes crumble and come away in their hands. It was called radium jaw. Their hips would shatter. Their spines would collapse. They were being burned alive by their own skeletons. The wristwatch, the object that had saved so many lives in the trenches, was now killing the people who made them in the most agonizing way possible. The scandal and the subsequent lawsuits from the Radium Girls eventually changed labor laws forever, but the damage was done. When those women were buried, they were buried in lead-lined coffins. If you go to a cemetery in New Jersey today and hold a Geiger counter over their graves, the ground will still scream. They will be radioactive for another 1,000 years. This is the hidden hardship of the object on your wrist. The luxury of seeing in the dark was baptized in the blood of factory workers. By the late 1930s, the industry was forced to change. They kept using radium, but they stopped letting the girls lick the brushes. The glow remained, but the lip-dip paint ritual became a horror story whispered in the shadows of the watchmaking world. And just as the world was coming to terms with the cost of the First War's technology, the sky turned black again. If World War I was the beta test for the wristwatch, World War II was the full release. By 1939, nobody was arguing about whether a man should wear a watch on his wrist. The question was no longer if you should wear one, but which specification you were issued. This is where the wristwatch moved from a fashionable tool to a military standard. In the 1940s, the United States military realized that they couldn't just rely on whatever watches soldiers bought at the PX. They needed synchronization on a global scale. They needed a watch that could survive the humidity of the Pacific jungles, the sub-zero temperatures of high-altitude bombing runs over Germany, and the crushing pressure of the North Atlantic. They released a set of specifications that would define the look of the modern watch for the next century. The most famous of these was the A11. The A11 is often called the watch that won the war. It wasn't fancy, it didn't have a gold case or a tank design, it was a brutalist piece of engineering. It had a black dial with bold white Arabic numerals. It had a hacking movement, a feature that allowed the second hand to stop completely when you pulled the crown out. Think about why that matters. In the 19th century, noon was whenever the sun was highest over your specific town. But in the 1940s, if you are a B-17 navigator, you need to synchronize your watch with the rest of the fleet down to the exact second. You pull the crown, the second hand stops, you wait for the signal over the radio, and you push it back in. At that moment, 500 airplanes are moving as one single synchronized mind. The A11 was manufactured by the tens of millions by American companies like Elgin, Waltham, and Bulova. It was the first time that a high-precision, high-durability instrument was mass-produced for the common man. But as the A11 was conquering the air, a different kind of watch was being born in the depths of the ocean. This is where the social hierarchy of the watch takes another turn. In the early years of the war, the most elite soldiers were the frogmen, the underwater demolition teams. They faced a problem that even Hans Wilsdorf's oyster case hadn't fully solved. They didn't just need a watch that was water-resistant to a rainstorm. They needed a watch that could survive hours at depth. The Italians were the first to master this. The Panerai Radiomir, originally made with Rolex movements, was a monster of a watch. It was massive, 47 millimeters wide, designed to be read through a murky diving mask in the dark waters of the Mediterranean. It used a massive amount of radium paint, hence the name Radiomir, to ensure the divers could time their explosive charges. Suddenly, the size of a watch became a new status symbol. In the 1920s, a small, elegant watch was a sign of a gentleman. But by the 1940s, a big, rugged, quote-unquote, over-engineered watch was a sign of a specialist. The bigger the watch, the more, quote-unquote, dangerous the man wearing it probably was. The wristwatch was no longer just about telling time. It was about capability. It was an external organ that told the world exactly what kind of environment you were trained to survive. If you wore an A11, you were a man of the sky. If you wore a Panerai or a Longines COSD, you were a man of the sea. If you wore a Dirty Dozen, the 12 brands commissioned by the British MOD, you were a man of the mud. By 1945, the wristwatch had completed its transformation. It had gone from a feminine trinket to a radioactive miracle to an industrial weapon. And when the second generation of veterans came home from World War II, they didn't just bring back a habit of wearing watches. They brought back a demand for performance. They didn't want the delicate Art Deco squares of the 1930s. They wanted watches that looked like the gear they had used to liberate Europe. They wanted the black dials, the stainless steel cases, and the luminous hands. The civilian watch market was about to be hit by the tool watch revolution. The era of the professional was beginning. But as the mechanical watch reached its absolute peak of durability and precision, a silent assassin was being developed in a laboratory in New Jersey. An assassin made of silicon and electricity. The mechanical watch, the masterpiece of gears and springs that had survived 2 world wars, was about to face a world that no longer needed gears to tell the time, a world that was moving toward the atomic age. But before we see the mechanical watch almost go extinct, we have to look at the 1950s, the decade where the wristwatch became the ultimate prop of the hero. Because this was the decade of James Bond, Jacques Cousteau, and Mount Everest. This was the decade where the wristwatch stopped being a tool and became a myth. And the man who started that myth was a man standing on top of the world, wearing a watch that wasn't even supposed to be there. By the time the calendar turned to 1950, the wristwatch had completed its first 2 lives. It had survived its feminine childhood and its radioactive military adolescence. Now, it was entering its 3rd and most powerful phase, the golden age of the tool watch. This is the era where the wristwatch stopped being something you needed for war and became something you wanted for your soul. If the 1940s were about the slaughter of millions, the 1950s were about the triumph of the individual. This was the decade of the professional. Men who had spent years as cogs in a military machine now wanted to be the masters of their own destiny. They wanted to be pilots, racers, divers, and explorers. And the watch industry, led by the marketing geniuses in Switzerland, realized that they were no longer selling time. They were selling adrenaline. The 1950s transformed the wristwatch into a, quote, badge of capability. It became a piece of equipment that whispered to the world, I am a man who does things. Even if you were just a middle manager in a gray flannel suit sitting in a boring office in Manhattan, a certain watch on your wrist suggested that you could, if called upon, wrestle a shark or summit a peak. The first great myth of this era was born on May 29, 1953, at 29,032 feet above sea level, Mount Everest. For decades, Everest had been the, quote, 3rd pole, the ultimate unconquerable frontier. When Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay finally stood on that jagged, wind-whipped summit, they weren't just heroes, they were proof of human superiority over nature. And on their wrists were mechanical watches. But here is the, quote, sensory hardship that the history books often skip. At the top of Everest, the air is so thin, it feels like a jagged knife in your lungs. The temperature is 40 below zero. Your brain is starving for oxygen, making even the simplest task, like reading a dial, nearly impossible. A watch at that altitude isn't a luxury. It's a life support system. If the oil inside the movement freezes, or if the metal contracts too much in the cold, the gears stop. And if you don't know exactly how long you've been breathing from your limited oxygen tanks, you don't come down alive. Rolex had spent years preparing for this. They had been sponsoring Everest expeditions since the 1930s, using the mountain as a living laboratory. They gave Hillary a prototype that would eventually become the Rolex Explorer. It was a masterpiece of sensory engineering. It had a high-contrast dial with massive 369 numerals and a thick coating of, now safer, luminous paint. It was designed to be read by a dying man in a blizzard. When Hillary returned, Rolex launched a marketing campaign that was so aggressive it practically redefined the brand. They didn't just say their watch was good, they said it was the watch for the top of the world. But there is a paradoxical twist in this story that Rolex rarely mentions. While Hillary was wearing a Rolex, Tenzing Norgay was reportedly wearing a watch from a British company called Smiths. In the 1950s, Smiths was a powerhouse of British engineering. They were the local choice. But Smiths didn't have the marketing budget of the Swiss. They didn't have the myth-making machine. Within a few decades, Smiths would be a forgotten relic of the past. while the Rolex Explorer became one of the most expensive and sought-after watches in history. This was the lesson of the 1950s. It wasn't enough to be the best. You had to have the best story. And the story was moving from the peaks of the mountains to the crushing blackness of the sea. In 1954, a man named Jacques Cousteau released a documentary called The Silent World. It introduced millions of people to the beauty and the terror of the deep ocean. Cousteau was the ultimate modern man, a soldier, a scientist, and an adventurer. And he needed a watch that could do something no watch had ever done before. He didn't just need a waterproof watch. He needed a diving watch. This is where the social hierarchy of the watch takes its most important turn. Before 1953, if you wanted to show you were wealthy, you wore a thin, delicate gold watch. But Cousteau and the elite divers of the French Navy didn't want gold. They wanted steel. They wanted a watch that could survive the pressure of 300 feet below the surface. Two watches emerged at the exact same time to claim this new territory, the Rolex Submariner and the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. These watches introduced a mechanical feature that was so simple it was genius: the rotating bezel. Imagine you are 100 feet underwater. You are breathing through a primitive scuba regulator. You are surrounded by darkness. You have exactly 30 minutes of air. In that environment, your brain isn't thinking clearly. You can't do math. You can't remember exactly what time you started your dive. The rotating bezel solved this. You simply turn the outer ring of the watch until the zero marker aligns with the minute hand. Now, you don't have to tell the time. You just look at where the hand is on the bezel. It tells you exactly how many minutes you've been underwater. It is a visual countdown. It was a piece of high-stakes engineering that turned a watch into a survival gauge. But then, something strange happened. The social inversion reached its final form. Wealthy men who had never been deeper than a hotel swimming pool started buying submariners. They didn't buy them because they were divers. They bought them because they wanted to look like the kind of man who was a diver. The tool watch became a signaling device. By the late 1950s, the wristwatch had created a new category of human, the desktop explorer. You could sit in a boardroom in London or a law firm in Chicago wearing a diving watch that was engineered to survive the North Sea. You were signaling that you weren't just a paper pusher. You were a man of action who happened to be wearing a suit today. The watch was a quiet flex. It was a way to carry the sensory hardship of the frontier into the climate-controlled comfort of the city. And then, the myth was cemented by the most powerful force in the 20th century, the cinema. In 1962, a movie called Dr. No was released. The main character, James Bond, was the ultimate distillation of every wristwatch myth we've covered. He was a veteran of the war. He was a professional. He was a diver. He was a man of the world. And in the very first scene where we see his face, he is wearing a tuxedo. But on his wrist, he isn't wearing a thin, quote, gentlemanly gold watch. He is wearing a Rolex Submariner. This was the moment the, quote, great inversion was finalized. In 1890, a man in a tuxedo with a watch on his wrist would have been a laughingstock. But in 1962, James Bond made it the coolest thing on the planet. He wore a, quote, brutish steel diving watch with formal wear. He broke the rules of the 19th century and replaced them with the rules of the 20th. Bond didn't care about, quote, dignity. He cared about performance. He cared about having a watch that could tell the time while he was fighting an assassin underwater and still look good when he was drinking a martini 10 minutes later. The wristwatch had reached its peak. It was a cultural icon. It was a technological masterpiece. It was the, quote, alpha male prop. But as the Submariner was gleaming on the big screen, and as the Rolex Explorer was being celebrated at the top of the world, a group of scientists in Japan were looking at a tiny sliver of rock. They were looking at quartz. The mechanical watch, the device of springs, gears, and heroic myths, was about to face a reality it couldn't market its way out of. It was about to face a world where heroism was being replaced by efficiency. The industry was about to enter the quartz crisis, a period of 10 years where 90% of the watchmaking companies in the world would go bankrupt. The mechanical watch was about to be discarded as garbage. But before we see the death of the gear, we have to look at the space race. Because before the wristwatch was replaced by a computer, it had to go to the moon. And the watch that went to the moon wasn't a Rolex. It was a watch that had to pass a test so brutal it makes the trenches of World War I look like a vacation. It was time for the Omega Speedmaster to enter the story. By the mid-1960s, the mechanical wristwatch had conquered every corner of the Earth. It had survived the trenches of France, the jungles of the Pacific, the summit of Everest, and the crushing depths of the Mediterranean. It was no longer a piece of jewelry, it was a survival gauge. But in 1961, humanity decided to leave the Earth entirely. And in the silent, lethal vacuum of space, the wristwatch was about to face its most brutal torture test yet. This is where we move from the professional myth to the industrial inquisition. When NASA began the Gemini and Apollo programs, they weren't looking for a fashion statement. They were building a machine that had to function in an environment where the laws of physics themselves seemed to change. In space, there is no atmospheric pressure. There is no convection to cool down a machine. The temperature can swing from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun to 250 degrees below zero in the shade in a matter of seconds. NASA's engineers realized that if the onboard electronic timers failed, the astronauts would need a backup. They needed a mechanical chronograph, a stopwatch, that could time engine burns for re-entry. If your engine fires for 29 seconds instead of 30, you miss the Earth and drift into the black forever. In 1964, a NASA flight crew support engineer named James Reagan sent out a request to several watch companies. But he didn't go to the factories to ask for custom-built prototypes. In a move that still haunts the marketing departments of several Swiss brands, he reportedly went to a local jewelry store in Houston, Corrigan's, and simply bought several off-the-shelf chronographs. He bought a Rolex, a Longines, a Breitling, and an Omega Speedmaster. Then he subjected them to the Inquisition. This is the sensory hardship of the space age. These watches weren't just tested, they were tortured. The heat test, 48 hours at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by 30 minutes at 200 degrees. The cold test, 4 hours at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The vacuum test, being placed in a chamber where the air was sucked out until it mimicked an altitude of 100,000 feet, repeated 15 times. The vibration test, being strapped to a machine that shook them with the force of a Saturn V rocket launch for 9 hours. The acoustic noise test, 130 decibels of raw, vibrating sound, loud enough to shatter human eardrums. One by one, the giants fell. The Rolex stopped running during the heat test. The Longines crystal warped and flew off during the decompression test. Only one watch survived every single nightmare NASA threw at it without losing more than a few seconds of accuracy: the Omega Speedmaster. But here is the paradoxical twist. The Speedmaster wasn't designed for space. It was designed in 1957 for race car drivers. The tachymeter scale on the bezel was meant for timing laps at Monza, not orbits around the moon. But its construction was so robust, its Hesalite plastic crystal so resilient, plastic doesn't shatter like glass, which is vital in zero-G, where shards of glass could float into an astronaut's eye, that it became the flight-qualified standard. On July 20th, 1969, the Speedmaster reached the end of the road. But as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended toward the lunar surface, a small technical failure occurred. The electronic timer in the lunar module malfunctioned. Armstrong decided to leave his Speedmaster inside the module as a backup. So, when Buzz Aldrin stepped out onto the moon, he was wearing his Speedmaster over the sleeve of his bulky pressurized suit. That watch, the Moon Watch, became the most famous mechanical object in history. It was the absolute peak of the micromechanical era. A collection of springs and gears designed by men with slide rules, working perfectly in a world of silence and dust. The mechanical watch had won. It had gone from the wrist of a countess in 1868 to the surface of the moon in 1969. It was the ultimate alpha technology. And then, just 5 months later, the assassin arrived. On Christmas Day, 1969, in a glittering boutique in Tokyo, a company called Seiko released the Astron. It looked like a normal, elegant gold watch, but inside there were no gears. There was no mainspring. There was no balance wheel. Instead, there was a tiny sliver of quartz crystal. Think about the physics of the insult here. For 400 years, Swiss watchmaking had been about the heartbeat, the mechanical oscillation of a metal wheel. The best mechanical watches beat about 8 times per second. They were masterpieces of hand finishing and human engineering. The Seiko Astron used electricity to make a quartz crystal vibrate 32,768 times per second. It didn't matter how much heroic myth Rolex had. It didn't matter that Omega had been to the moon. A cheap, battery-powered Seiko was 20 times more accurate than the most expensive mechanical watch in Switzerland. It was more durable, it was thinner, and within a few years, it was 1,000 times cheaper. The quartz crisis had begun. And it wasn't just an economic crisis, it was an existential slaughter. The Swiss watch industry, which had survived 2 world wars, suddenly looked like a horse breeder in the age of the Ferrari. They were selling art in a world that wanted data. Between 1970 and 1983, the number of watchmaking jobs in Switzerland dropped from 90,000 to under 30,000. Over 1,000 companies vanished. The service watch, the trench watch, the diver, the entire masculine iconography we've spent blocks discussing was being tossed into the trash. In the 1970s, a mechanical watch was seen as garbage. People were literally trading their mechanical Rolexes for digital LED Seikos and Casios. The digital watch was the new quote-unquote modernity. It was the era of Star Wars and the personal computer. The quote-unquote ritual of the gear was replaced by the quote glow of the liquid crystal display. But here is where the quote-unquote social hierarchy takes its most bizarre and final turn. In the 1980s, a man named Nicholas Hayek realized that the Swiss couldn't beat the Japanese at quote-unquote accuracy. They had lost that war. If you wanted the quote-unquote true time, you bought a Casio for $10. So Hayek decided that if the watch was no longer a quote-unquote tool, it had to become quote identity. He launched the Swatch. It was plastic. It was cheap. It was colorful. It was quote-unquote disposable. It saved the Swiss industry by turning the watch into quote-unquote fashion for the masses. But at the same time, the high-end brands like Patek Philippe and Rolex made a move that was even bolder. They leaned into the quote-unquote uselessness. They stopped trying to be quote-unquote accurate. They started being art. They realized that in a world where everyone has a perfect clock on their microwave, their car dashboard, and eventually their phone, the only reason to wear a mechanical watch is to show that you can afford to care about, quote, the old ways. The, quote, micromechanical watch moved from the, quote, frontier to the, quote, museum of the wrist. It became the ultimate quiet flex. Wearing a mechanical watch in the 21st century is a deliberate act of defiance against the digital world. It is a way to say, I appreciate the 3,000 years of history that led to this gear. But we aren't done. because while the mechanical watch was becoming a, quote, luxury artifact, the digital watch was evolving into something far more invasive. It was evolving into the, quote, smartwatch. And in this final evolution, the, quote, trench watch is making a terrifying comeback. Because the smartwatch isn't just, quote, on your wrist. It is monitoring your biology. It is tracking your heart rate, your steps, your sleep, and your location. We have come full circle. We started with a watch that was, quote, feminine jewelry. We moved to a watch that was a, quote, military tool for survival. And we have ended with a watch that is a biometric tether. The, quote, synchronization that started in the trenches of WWI has reached its final form. We are no longer just, quote, using the clock. We are being clocked. But before we wrap up this 80,000 character journey, we have to look at the, quote, soul of the object. Why, after all this technology, do we still love the, quote, mechanical ghost? Why does a billionaire still pay $100 million for a Patek Philippe when his iPhone tells better time? The answer lies in the, quote, looming end. The story of the watch is the story of our struggle against our own mortality. And in the final blocks, we will see how the wristwatch became the only object we truly leave behind. By the mid-1980s, the mechanical watch was supposed to be dead. It was a quote-unquote buggy whip in the age of the jet engine. If you were a rational human being in 1985, you wore a digital Casio or a thin, quartz-powered Seiko. They were objectively better in every measurable category. They were cheaper, more accurate, and required zero maintenance. The mechanical watch, with its 200 tiny friction-prone parts that needed to be oiled and serviced like a 19th century steam locomotive, was an evolutionary dead end. But then, the, quote, social hierarchy of the wrist performed its most incredible trick. It turned inefficiency into a luxury. This is where we meet the architect of the Renaissance, a man named Jean-Claude Bivet. In 1982, at the absolute height of the quartz crisis, Bivet bought the rights to a defunct name, Blancpain. The company had been dead since the 70s. Bivet bought it for a few $1,000s and launched a marketing campaign that was so arrogant it was brilliant. His slogan was, "Since 1735, there has never been a quartz Blancpain watch, and there never will be." Think about the psychology of the insult here. Biver wasn't apologizing for the fact that mechanical watches were less accurate. He was bragging about it. He realized that in a world of mass-produced, soulless silicon chips, the ticking of a mechanical gear was a connection to the human spirit. He turned the mechanical watch into an analog counterculture. He understood a fundamental truth about humans. We value what is difficult. A quartz watch is magic that happens inside a black box. A mechanical watch is labor you can see through a sapphire crystal caseback. By the 1990s, the mechanical watch had successfully transitioned from a tool to a kinetic sculpture. And as the art of watchmaking was being revived in Switzerland, a new kind of sensory hardship was becoming a fashion statement for the ultra-wealthy, the brutalist watch. In the 19th century, a gentleman wanted his watch to be invisible. In the 1950s, a professional wanted it to be capable. But in the 1990s, the alpha male of the corporate world wanted his watch to be violent. This was the era of the big watch. It started when an Italian brand with a deep military history, Panerai, was discovered by Sylvester Stallone. Panerai hadn't sold watches to the public for decades. They were a secret supplier to the Italian Navy's frogmen. Their watches were huge, 44 millimeters or 47 millimeters, with massive lever-action crown guards designed to keep out the pressure of the Mediterranean. Stallone wore one in the movie Daylight, 1996, and suddenly the hardship of the diver became the uniform of the Hollywood elite. The watch was no longer an elegant square or a modest circle. It was a tank for the wrist. It was a way for a man who spent his life in air-conditioned trailers to signal that he had the wrist strength of a commando. The service watch had returned, but this time it was performance art. But as the new watches got bigger and louder, a silent movement was happening in the shadows of the auction houses. A movement that would lead to the most expensive scrap metal in history, the vintage market. This is the most paradoxical twist in the entire 200-year story. In the 1970s, people threw away their old mechanical watches because they were broken or outdated. But by the 2010s, those same broken watches became the ultimate status symbols. Why? Because of patina. In the world of the digital and the new, everything is perfect. Every iPhone screen is identical. But a trench watch from 1917 or a Submariner from 1958 carries the scars of its life. The radium paint on the dial browns over time, creating what collectors call a tropical dial. The hands might be slightly oxidized. The bezel might be faded by the sun of 1,000 dives. To a modern billionaire, this damage is more valuable than gold, because it is authentic. In 2017, a 1968 Rolex Daytona, a watch that was a commercial failure when it was first released because it was considered too clunky, sold at auction for $17.7 million. Why? Because it had belonged to Paul Newman. It was a tool watch that had actually been used by a man who raced cars and lived a real life. The social hierarchy had reached its final absurd peak. A damaged, inaccurate steel watch from the 1960s was worth more than a fleet of private jets. We were no longer buying a way to tell the time. We were buying a way to feel human in a world of screens. And then, in April 2015, the screens arrived on the wrist. The Apple Watch was not the first smartwatch, but it was the one that finalized the great inversion. When Tim Cook stood on stage and announced a device that sat on the wrist but functioned as a computer, the watch industry trembled. They thought it was the quartz crisis all over again. But the Apple Watch did something the quartz watch never did. It changed the contract of the wrist. For 100 years, the wristwatch was a tool of independence. You put it on so you could know the time. You used it to navigate, to dive, to survive. The watch served you. But the smartwatch is a tool of surveillance. Think about the biometric tether. The modern smartwatch doesn't just tell you the time, it tells the system about you. It tracks your heart rate. It monitors your blood oxygen. It counts your steps. It knows where you are via GPS. It pokes you with haptic vibrations when you've been sitting too long. It notifies you of emails and texts, ensuring that the front line of the digital economy is now permanently strapped to your body. The service watch of 1914 was designed to help a soldier synchronize with his unit to avoid death. The smartwatch of 2024 is designed to help a worker synchronize with the grid to maximize productivity. We have moved from synchronization for survival to synchronization for optimization. And here is the bizarre social irony. Today, the most powerful people in the world often wear no watch at all, or a very simple Apple Watch. They are so connected, so governed by the digital world, that they don't need to signal their status through gears. But the aspirant, the artist, and the rebel, they are the ones wearing the mechanical watches. We have entered a world where the most advanced technology is the cheapest and most common, while the most primitive technology, the collection of brass gears and hairsprings, is the most expensive and rare. Look at the wrist of a CEO today. He is wearing a piece of glass that will be obsolete and e-waste in 3 years. But look at the wrist of the man sitting across from him, wearing a 1950s Omega. That watch has survived the moon landing, the quartz crisis, and the death of its original owner. It will still be ticking in 100 years, long after the CEO's smartwatch has been recycled into a soda can. The mechanical ghost has won the war of permanence. But as we reach the final block of this journey, we have to ask the ultimate question. In a world of AI, smart contacts, and neural links, why do we still feel the need to strap anything to our arms? Why does the ritual of the wrist persist? The answer isn't in the technology, it's in our biology. It's in the looming end that every watch, from the radium-painted trench watch to the latest heart rate monitor, is trying to help us ignore. The story of the watch is the story of how we tried to tame the tiger of time. And in the final block, we will see that the tiger always wins. But the watch is the only thing that remains to tell the story of the fight. We are going back to the one room where it all ends, to the moment where the ticking stops and the watch is passed from one hand to the next. We have reached the end of the road. We have traveled from the velvet-lined pockets of the Victorian elite to the radioactive mud of the Somme, from the freezing peaks of Everest to the silent vacuum of the moon, and finally into the silicon-etched surveillance of the modern smartwatch. We have seen a feminine trinket become a weapon of war, a symbol of professional heroism, a piece of obsolete garbage, and finally a multi-million-dollar work of art. And now we arrive at the most profound part of the entire story, the paradox of invisibility. Look at your wrist one more time, or look at the person sitting across from you. If they are wearing a watch, you probably don't see it. You don't see the 300 years of metallurgical struggle that allowed a hairspring to be thinner than a human hair. You don't see the Radium Girls whose bones dissolve to make the dial glow. You don't see the B-17 navigators who synchronize their A-11s to drop a curtain of steel over Europe. The wristwatch has succeeded so completely that it has become invisible. It has become a quote-unquote default setting of the human body. We take it for granted that we can carry a perfectly synchronized atomic clock or a masterpiece of Swiss gears into a shower, onto a plane, or into a mountain blizzard. But this invisibility is a mask for a much deeper, more haunting truth. Because the wristwatch is the only object in your life that is obsessed with your end, think about the sensory reality of a mechanical watch. If you hold it to your ear, you hear a heartbeat, a rapid, frantic tick, 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 tick. In a world of silent screens and digital, quote, black mirrors, the mechanical watch is the only machine we own that feels alive. It has a pulse. It has a, quote, heart, the balance wheel, and arteries, the gear train. And yet, it is a pulse that is fundamentally indifferent to yours. The watch doesn't care if you are happy, or if you are in pain, or if you are winning or losing. It only cares about the mathematics of decay. It is a machine that measures the exact rate at which your life is leaking away. This is why, in the 21st century, the social hierarchy of the watch has performed its final, most poetic maneuver, the heirloom. In our modern, disposable age, we live in a world of planned obsolescence. Your laptop will be slow in 3 years. Your smartphone will be a paperweight in 5. Your electric car's battery will degrade. We are surrounded by objects that are designed to die so that we are forced to buy them again. We are trapped in a cycle of digital waste. But a mechanical watch is the only object that rejects this contract. This is the quiet flex of the 19th century gear in the 21st century world. When you buy a high-end mechanical watch, you aren't just buying a tool, you are buying permanence. You are buying something that can outlive you. You are buying a ghost. There is a famous advertisement for Patek Philippe that has run for decades. It says, "You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation." It sounds like a snobbish marketing slogan for billionaires, but underneath the elitism is a profound philosophical truth that the trench watch veterans would have understood perfectly. A watch is a bridge. It is the only machine that remembers the warmth of its owner's skin. When a father passes his watch to his son or a mother to her daughter, they aren't just passing a piece of jewelry. they are passing a record of time spent. The scratches on the case are the records of the owner's struggles. The patina on the dial is the record of the sun they stood under. The watch is a witness. Think about a watch found in an attic, 50 years after its owner has passed away. You pick it up. It's cold. It's silent. But then you turn the crown. You feel the sensory resistance of the mainspring tightening. You hear the first tentative click. And suddenly, the mechanical ghost wakes up. The gears start to turn. The second hand begins to sweep. In that moment, the watch is doing exactly what it was doing on the wrist of a soldier in 1916 or a diver in 1954. It is performing the same ritual of synchronization that has governed our species for a century. It is a piece of living history that you can wear on your arm. But we must also look at the looming end of the wristwatch itself. Because as we move into the era of Neuralink, augmented reality, and AI, the wrist might finally be liberated. We are moving toward a world where time is projected directly onto our retinas or whispered into our ears by an algorithm. In that world, the wristlet will finally go back to what it was in 1860, an ornament. We will wear watches, not because we need to know the time. We will know the time the way we know how to breathe, but because we want to feel the weight of the past. We will wear them as mechanical anchors to remind us that we are biological creatures, not just users of a network. The story of the watch is the story of how we tried to tame the chaos of the universe. We began with a hole in the wall, the window, to let the light in. We moved to a hole in the pocket, the watch, to keep the time in. And we ended with a device on the wrist that captures our heartbeats, our locations, and our memories. We have spent 200,000 years trying to find our place in the world. For most of that time, we were governed by the sun, the moon, and the seasons. We were part of the Great Rhythm. But 100 years ago, in the mud of the Western Front, we decided that the Great Rhythm wasn't fast enough. We decided that we needed to be synchronized. We traded our freedom for the second hand. We gained the ability to coordinate a global economy, to land on the moon, and to communicate across oceans in milliseconds. But we lost the ability to be still. The watch on our wrist is a permanent reminder that the creeping barrage of time is always moving forward, always pushing us toward the next mark on the bezel. So, the next time you look at your watch, whether it's a glowing screen or a ticking gear, give it one extra second. You aren't just looking at the time. You are looking at 1,000 years of shivering, dreaming, dying, and inventing. You are looking at the Radium Girls and the Frogmen. You are looking at Hans Wilsdorf's marketing stunts and Buzz Aldrin's lunar stroll. You are looking at a miracle of the body. The wristwatch is the only machine we have ever allowed to become part of our physical form. It is the micro-history of our species, wrapped around a few inches of leather or steel. It is the mark of our ambition and the record of our mortality. And if the day ever comes when we stop wearing them, when the wrist is finally empty and the time is everywhere, something essential about being human will have ended. We will have finally won the war against time, but we will have lost the only object that told us the story of the fight. But for now, the ticking continues. The mechanical ghost is still here, sitting in the dark of your drawer or the light of your arm, waiting for the next hand to wind it, waiting for the next generation to look down and ask, "How much time do I have left?" And the watch, indifferent and perfect, will simply keep on ticking. Because it has seen the end of the world before, and it knows that even when the owner stops, the gear must turn. The feminine bracelet has become the undeclared king of the modern world, and it is so perfect